Tokyo, the 6th of May, 1947. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in occupied Japan, sent a cable back to Washington that would stay classified for the next 3 decades. In it, he recommended that a group of Japanese scientists responsible for the deaths of thousands of prisoners be quietly assured, through intelligence channels rather than any formal legal process, that what they knew would never be used against them in a war crimes court. At almost exactly the same moment, on the other side of the world, American prosecutors at Nuremberg were standing in front of the world's cameras, arguing that Nazi doctors who had experimented on concentration camp prisoners represented one of the purest evils the war had produced, and that no nation, no wartime pressure, and no scientific justification could excuse it. Both things were happening at once, inside the same American government, within months of each other. This is the real story of Unit 731, the thousands of people who died inside it, and the decision that let almost everyone responsible walk free. If you want the real documented history of the Pacific War, including the parts the United States kept classified for decades, this channel exists to tell it straight. This one deals with genuinely dark material, so a fair warning before we start, but the story is real, and it deserves to be told accurately rather than avoided. Unit 731 began, on paper, as a research institution established by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1936 in the Japanese puppet state of Manchuria, in occupied Manchuria, under the command of a physician named Shiro Ishii, a graduate of Kyoto Imperial University's medical school with an almost missionary belief in the strategic potential of biological warfare. Ishii was, by the accounts of colleagues who worked alongside him, a genuinely gifted researcher and an equally gifted political operator. Someone who understood as well as anyone in the Japanese military bureaucracy how to translate a scientific ambition into sustained institutional funding. He had spent years in the late 1920s and early 1930s lobbying senior Japanese military leadership with a straightforward, chilling argument that germ warfare was cheap to develop compared to conventional weapons, difficult for an enemy to detect until it was too late to respond, and explicitly prohibited by international law under the 1925 Geneva Protocol, a fact Ishii treated less as a moral boundary than as evidence that no other major power was likely to be developing the same capability openly, leaving Japan a potential strategic advantage if it moved first and quietly. The army agreed, funded him generously through a military budget structure designed to obscure the program's true purpose from outside scrutiny, and gave him the facility, the staff, and the operational freedom to build what would become the largest and most systematic program of human experimentation the world had seen outside Nazi Germany's own medical atrocities, eventually commanding a complex that included its own airfield, prison blocks, laboratories, and crematorium, staffed at its peak by several thousand personnel, many of them legitimate research scientists recruited from Japan's most prestigious universities under the belief they were advancing the country's medical knowledge. The scale of what happened inside Unit 731's compound near the city of Harbin is difficult to state simply, in part because Japanese personnel destroyed a significant portion of the unit's own records in the final days of the war, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of accounting. Scholarly estimates of the death toll inside the facility itself range from roughly 3,000 to as many as 10 or 12,000 people. The wide range itself, a reflection of how thoroughly the paper trail was burned before Soviet forces reached the area in August of 1945. The victims were overwhelmingly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with Soviet, Mongolian, Korean, and a smaller number of Allied prisoners who passed through Japanese custody during the war. Internally, Staff at the facility did not refer to the people held there as prisoners or subjects. The official term used inside Unit 731's own paperwork was maruta, the Japanese word for logs, a piece of institutional language specifically chosen to strip the people inside the compound of any status as human beings before a single experiment was ever conducted on them. There is no documented case of anyone surviving imprisonment inside the facility's inner compound. What happened to the people held there fell broadly into categories that Ishii's program treated as legitimate scientific inquiry. The deliberate infection of prisoners with diseases including plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid, to study how the illnesses progressed and how effectively they might be weaponized and delivered against military or civilian populations. Extreme physiological testing, including controlled exposure to freezing temperatures to study the progression of frostbite, and invasive surgical procedures conducted on living, unanesthetized prisoners, justified internally as necessary to observe biological processes that anesthesia might have altered or masked. This channel isn't going to walk through the specific methodology of what happened inside those walls in more detail than that, both because the details themselves serve no purpose beyond shock value, and because the actual story that deserves telling here isn't really about the atrocities in isolation. Atrocities like this, horrifying as they are, happened in more than one theater of the Second World War. What makes Unit 731 a genuinely different kind of story is what happened after American forces found out about it. When American occupation authorities began investigating Japanese biological warfare capabilities in the months after the surrender, they did not immediately understand the scale of what they were looking at. Japan's surrender documents said nothing specific about a biological weapons program, and initial American intelligence assessments treated rumors of Japanese germ warfare research as a lower priority than more visible questions about conventional military capability and war crimes committed against American and Allied prisoners in more familiar settings: prison camps, forced labor sites, and battlefield conduct. MacArthur assigned Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, an American bacteriologist serving with the occupation government and one of the few officers in the theater with the scientific background, to recognize what he was looking at, to lead the initial inquiry, interviewing Japanese officials and gradually piecing together the outline of a program considerably larger and more organized than anything American intelligence had previously assessed. Sanders' early interviews, conducted with Japanese scientists who had varying degrees of willingness to cooperate, suggested a program whose scale and sophistication genuinely startled the American investigators assigned to evaluate it. Years of systematic data that no Western research program, bound by the ethical and legal constraints that governed legitimate medical science, could ever have legally produced. As the investigation deepened through 1946 and into 1947, American officials working the case, coordinating with researchers connected to the United States' own biological warfare research program at Camp Detrick in Maryland, arrived at a proposal that would define the rest of this story. Camp Detrick was not a hypothetical or dormant facility. The United States had operated its own active biological weapons research program throughout the war, smaller and considerably more constrained by ethical research standards than Ishii's operation, but staffed by scientists who understood immediately what years of unrestricted human data could mean for accelerating research that had, until that point, been limited to animal testing and small-scale consenting human trials. Rather than pursuing Ishii and his senior researchers as war criminals, American intelligence officers suggested offering them immunity from prosecution in exchange for complete access to everything Unit 731 had learned. Years of data on disease transmission, human physiological response, and biological weapons effectiveness that no ethical research program could ever have legally produced, and that American scientists now had the opportunity to acquire without having to conduct a single one of the experiments themselves. It was, in this sense, the same basic bargain the United States was striking in Europe at almost the identical moment through Operation Paperclip, the program that quietly recruited German rocket scientists, including men with direct ties to the slave labor conditions at Nazi V-2 production facilities, into American aerospace research rather than prosecuting them, on the theory that their expertise was too valuable to the coming Cold War to sacrifice to a courtroom. Unit 731's immunity deal simply applied the identical calculus to biological rather than rocket science, trading justice for capability on both sides of the world within the same 2-year window. The justification, laid out candidly in internal American communications from the period, centered on the emerging Cold War rather than on any question of the data's own value in isolation. Soviet forces had captured a number of lower-ranking Unit 731 personnel when they overran Japanese positions in Manchuria in the final days of the war. And American officials feared that if the United States pursued formal prosecution of Ishii and his senior staff, the Soviet Union might reach a competing arrangement first, or extract the same data through its own investigation of the personnel already in Soviet custody, leaving the United States with neither the intelligence advantage nor the moral credit for having prosecuted the crimes properly. Intelligence value, American officials concluded in the documents that survive from this period, outweighed the demands of justice. It was, in the driest possible bureaucratic language, a straightforward trade, silence, and data in exchange for freedom. MacArthur's own involvement went beyond simply approving a recommendation that reached his desk from subordinates. His May 1947 cable to Washington argued explicitly that additional information could likely be extracted from Ishii and his colleagues if they were assured, through intelligence channels rather than any formal or public process, that what they disclosed would never surface as evidence in a war crimes tribunal. According to multiple later accounts drawing on the declassified record, MacArthur was informed at some point during this process that Allied prisoners of war, not only Chinese and Soviet captives, had also died inside Unit 731's experiments, a detail that in almost any other context would have triggered a formal war crimes investigation on its own. Rather than reopening or expanding the inquiry once he had that information, MacArthur ordered the criminal investigation into Unit 731 to stop. The deal was finalized over the following months. Ishii and his most senior colleagues handed over research files, pathology slides, and detailed autopsy reports documenting years of human experimentation, material later absorbed into the American Biological Weapons Research Program at Camp Detrick, the same facility where Ishii's data had helped shape the trajectory of the United States' own biowarfare research for years afterward. Declassified documents later revealed the United States government paid the former Unit 731 researchers directly for portions of this material, sums reported in the surviving paperwork somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 yen. When the Soviet Union formally requested that Ishii and his senior colleagues be prosecuted at the broader Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, where senior Japanese military and political leadership was being tried for offenses across the entire Pacific theater, American authorities rejected the request. Ishii died in 1959 of natural causes, having never faced a criminal court for anything that happened inside the facility he built and commanded for nearly a decade. The Soviet Union did not extend the same courtesy to the personnel it had captured. In December of 1949, at Khabarovsk, Soviet military prosecutors tried 12 former Japanese military personnel connected to biological warfare programs, including some lower-ranking Unit 731 staff who had fallen into Soviet rather than American custody, on charges connected to the development and testing of biological weapons. All 12 were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 2 to 25 years in a Soviet labor camp. Sentences that, whatever their political motivations, still represented the only formal criminal court anywhere in the world to hear direct testimony about the program and to impose any consequence for it at all. The United States dismissed the Khabarovsk trials at the time as Soviet propaganda, a characterization that suited Washington's interests, given what American intelligence was simultaneously negotiating with the far more senior officials the Soviets hadn't managed to capture, and Western media coverage of the period largely echoed that framing, meaning the only formal criminal accounting for Unit 731's crimes anywhere in the world came from the one government the United States had every institutional reason to discredit, while the men who had actually designed and commanded the program lived out ordinary post-war lives entirely outside any courtroom. Here's the thing worth being direct about, because the timing here isn't incidental. It's the entire point of why this story matters beyond its own considerable horror. While American negotiators were quietly assuring Ishii that his data would buy him a life free of prosecution, American prosecutors at Nuremberg were making, on the record, in front of the entire world, the opposite argument about a nearly identical category of crime. The Nuremberg doctors' trial, formerly known as United States versus Karl Brandt, ran from December of 1946 through August of 1947, prosecuting 23 defendants, most of them physicians, for medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners, experiments that in their basic shape, disease exposure, extreme physiological stress, including hypothermia studies disturbingly similar in method to what Unit 731 had conducted in Manchuria, procedures conducted without meaningful consent on captive populations, closely resembled what Ishii's program had spent nearly a decade doing. American prosecutors argued, and the tribunal agreed, that scientific curiosity and even genuine military necessity could never justify experimentation on unconsenting human beings, a principle stated as an absolute rather than a balance to be weighed against other strategic considerations. 16 of the defendants were convicted. 7 were sentenced to death and executed the following year. Out of that same trial came the Nuremberg Code, 10 principles establishing that voluntary, informed consent is an absolute prerequisite for any legitimate human research, a document American scientists helped draft, and that remains, to this day, the foundational ethical text underlying every modern human subject's protection regulation in medicine. The United States helped write that code, prosecuted doctors under it, sent men to the gallows for violating it, and at almost the exact same moment, quietly exempted a program that had killed more people through more extensive and arguably more systematic experimentation from any equivalent reckoning at all, because the men responsible for it happened to be useful rather than merely guilty. No American official ever offered a public explanation reconciling those two positions, because for decades almost no member of the public knew there was anything to reconcile. The Nuremberg verdicts were announced in open court, reported in newspapers worldwide, taught in law schools as a foundational moment in international human rights law. The Unit 731 immunity arrangement was negotiated in classified cables, paid for in yen nobody was meant to trace, and kept out of the public record for the better part of 40 years. The defense some officials offered at the time, and that some historians still treat as at least partially serious rather than purely cynical, rests on the specific texture of 1947, a year when the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had already curdled into open rivalry, when American planners genuinely believed a biological attack from a hostile power was a live strategic risk rather than a hypothetical one, and when the intelligence community operated on the theory that data obtained unethically by someone else could still be put to legitimate defensive use once it existed, a moral shortcut that American and Soviet intelligence services both leaned on repeatedly across the opening decades of the Cold War, from German rocket scientists absorbed through Operation Paperclip to exactly this kind of biological warfare data. That argument explains the decision. It does not obviously justify it, and it becomes considerably harder to sustain once you place it next to the specific detail that MacArthur is reported to have learned. Allied prisoners of war died inside the same program and ordered the investigation stopped anyway. A choice that wasn't about extracting value from an enemy's crimes against a rival power's citizens, but about protecting the men responsible, even after American service members were confirmed among the dead. The story stayed almost entirely out of public view for decades. The immunity arrangement remained classified well into the 1980s, and the American government made no formal acknowledgement of what had been negotiated until journalists and historians, most notably the American scholar Sheldon Harris and the investigative journalist John Powell, working from declassified archives obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests filed decades after the fact, began reconstructing the record piece by piece, decades after most of the people directly involved on every side of the arrangement were already dead. Survivors and descendants of Unit 731's victims in China have spent decades since pushing for formal acknowledgement and apology, work that continues into the present day, with individual survivors still giving public testimony well into their 90s, describing a program that most of the world learned about only long after any meaningful legal accountability had become impossible, and a Japanese government that has, even now, never issued the kind of full formal apology and reparations framework that survivors and their descendants have spent generations requesting. So here's where this one actually lands. And unlike some of the more genuinely contested strategic debates this channel has covered, this isn't one where the honest answer sits evenly between two defensible positions. The decision to trade impunity for data was made by people who understood, in real time, exactly what they were trading away. And the timing next to Nuremberg makes the moral inconsistency impossible to explain as an accident of history rather than a deliberate choice about whose crimes counted as prosecutable and whose counted as merely useful. Cold War pressure was real. The fear of Soviet biological capability was real. Neither of those pressures required extending impunity specifically to the men who built and ran the program, rather than prosecuting them and still finding some other way to secure whatever genuine defensive value their research held. An alternative the United States had every legal and institutional capacity to pursue and chose not to. The United States chose the version of the outcome that protected Ishii, and it did so at almost the exact same moment it was telling the world, correctly, that scientific value can never excuse experimentation on unconsenting human beings. Both of those things happened, inside the same government, within months of each other. Only one of them made it into the history books most people actually read, and the other stayed classified long enough that the men it protected mostly died free, in their own beds, having never once had to answer for what the paperwork they handed over so carefully documented. If you want more of the real, documented history of the Pacific War, including the parts governments would have preferred stayed buried, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think justice would have actually required here.